Hamilton let down after Canada. This engine just isn't good enough to win. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The Canadian skies had finally given way to a heavy, humid calm as the rain that had blanketed the Circuit Gilles-Villeneuve earlier in the day faded into nothing more than a wet sheen across the tarmac and motorhomes. Yet despite the absence of precipitation, the weight in the air remained. It clung to every surface, every breath, every word left unspoken. There was a charge in the environment, almost like static, a sense of something unbalanced. Something broken. Lewis Hamilton had just exited his Ferrari after a deeply disappointing qualifying session, P6, far from where he or anyone in Maranello believed he belonged. Rather than return immediately to the safety of his garage or engage with his engineers, he veered off, walking with slow, deliberate strides into the narrow corridor between the rear of the Ferrari hospitality unit and a stack of crates covered in tarps. He moved like a man carrying a burden no one else could feel, each step echoing with silent frustration. His face was unreadable, but there was something unmistakably clenched in his jawline, something restrained in the movement of his arms now folded across his chest as he stood still, back to the world, his helmet dangling from his left hand like a weapon that had failed him. A few persistent members of the media had followed from a distance, unsure of whether to approach. Eventually, lured by instinct and emboldened by career habit, they came closer, micro-recorders in hand, boom mics floating overhead like vultures circling a wounded animal. Lewis didn't lash out. He didn't storm away. He didn't demand silence. What he gave them was far more dangerous. He spoke, and what came from his mouth wasn't the polished diplomacy expected from a global icon, nor the guarded phrasing that usually colors every word from a seasoned veteran aware of every possible headline. Instead, it was raw, deliberate, and heavy with a kind of truth that doesn't beg for interpretation, it demands reckoning. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. He said that the car felt alien to him. Not just imperfect or difficult to drive, but foreign, as if it had been built for someone else's hands, not his. He criticized its responsiveness, its lack of soul. He spoke about the engine not in terms of numbers or specs, but in emotional terms. He said it lacked heart, that it felt manufactured rather than crafted. But then, in a tone that remained calm, unshaken, yet sharper than any raised voice could have been, he delivered the real shock. He said he felt deceived. Not by one technician, not by one department, not because of a single race result, but betrayed at a foundational level by the very vision, philosophy, and structure that had convinced him to wear red in the first place. This wasn't about poor performance. It was about a breach of belief. The ripple effect was immediate and catastrophic. The word spread like a virus through the paddock, mutated into whispers, then shouts, then full-blown headlines flashing across screens inside every team's garage. Inside Ferrari's own working space, it was as though time stalled. Technicians froze in place, half-finished tasks left hanging in the air. Mechanics with decades of experience looked around as if searching for some kind of guidance or instruction. Engineers huddled around monitors showing his quotes on replay, not sure whether to pretend not to see or to prepare for damage control. No one had expected this level of candor, especially not in public. Charles Leclerc had been watching the qualifying footage in silence, seated alone on a bench between two tire stacks. His headset rested on his shoulders, and his arms hung loose over his knees. As the words spilled from Lewis's mouth and were translated into headlines in real time, he straightened. The easy posture vanished. His expression hardened. The screen in front of him now played Lewis's interview on loop, and with each repetition, a deeper frustration took root in Charles's face. When Lewis eventually stepped back into the garage, silence consumed the room like a wave. Without hesitation, Charles stood. His walk toward Lewis wasn't rushed or theatrical. It was steady, firm, and purposeful. The confrontation unfolded without physicality, without yelling, but it was nonetheless charged with emotion. Leclerc accused Hamilton of fracturing the internal fabric of the team, of dismantling the fragile trust that had taken months to build. He said morale was not just low, it was shattered, and that public denunciations didn't just hurt reputations, they dismantled relationships. The Monégasque driver argued that Ferrari was more than a car, more than a strategy. Ferrari was a culture, a legacy, a family. And families didn't resolve their issues through interviews. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Lewis listened without interruption. His eyes locked on Charles's, his body still, as though absorbing every syllable. When he replied, his tone was unwavering, neither defensive nor dismissive. He countered that blind loyalty had no place in greatness. That decades of underachievement had been masked by nostalgia and prestige. That protecting feelings at the expense of progress was the true betrayal. He said silence had become Ferrari's most lethal habit. Silence when improvements were needed. Silence when politics overtook performance. Silence in the face of avoidable mediocrity. There were no raised voices, but the intensity of their exchange was almost unbearable. Engineers pretended to be busy. No one looked directly at the two drivers. Even the rhythm of the garage's mechanical sounds seemed to pause, awaiting a conclusion. Charles, visibly agitated, told Lewis he was more invested in managing his brand than integrating with the team. Lewis, without flinching, replied that he would rather be hated for authenticity than admired for compliance. That he didn't come to Maranello to be comfortable, he came to win. And if that meant challenging sacred cows, so be it. The standoff dissolved without a resolution. Charles turned, jaw tight, and walked away, mumbling in his native tongue, anger tightly bottled under his breath. Lewis remained rooted in place for a moment, then walked past the telemetry screens and sat on a folding chair next to the gearbox table. He rested his elbows on his knees, stared into a space no one else could see, and said absolutely nothing for 10 straight minutes. Around him, people moved, but none spoke. He was surrounded, yet entirely alone. A man drifting in a sea of red, detached, unreachable. Elsewhere in the paddock, the reaction was immediate and universal. At Red Bull, Verstappen chuckled in disbelief, nudging Christian Horner and muttering something sarcastic about how long it would take before Ferrari chewed Hamilton up and spit him out like so many before him. At Mercedes, Toto Wolff watched with conflicted eyes. There was no joy, only concern. He had seen this pattern before. At McLaren, Piastri and Norris exchanged glances, both silently aware that something seismic had shifted. Within minutes, the Ferrari press team was thrown into chaos. Social media went into lockdown. Internal channels stopped communicating. The post-session debrief was cancelled without explanation. A press release was eventually issued late in the evening. It included no quotes from Lewis, no mention of the incident, no context. Just a hollow phrase: "We will analyze, reset, and return stronger." But the people inside the garage knew better. This wasn't a routine setback. It was a rupture. The fracture wasn't technical. It wasn't about lap time. It was existential. It was the collision between two belief systems, one built on legacy and tradition, the other on transparency and disruption. Lewis Hamilton didn't just critique the car, he challenged the very DNA of the team. And in doing so, he isolated himself in ways no telemetry could measure, no data point could explain. As night fell over the circuit and the last lights of the paddock dimmed, the silence returned, thicker, colder. The mechanics packed away their tools with the mechanical precision of people trying not to think. The engineers typed their reports with emotionless keystrokes. No one knew what the next day would bring, but one thing had become painfully clear: Lewis Hamilton may have signed with Ferrari, but the question that now lingered was far more profound. Could Ferrari, in all its glory and rigidity, ever truly make room for a spirit as untamed and defiant as his? And more hauntingly, would he ever want to belong to a place that asked him to tame that fire in the first place? Frederick Vasseur requested a private meeting with Lewis Hamilton exactly 61 minutes after the final engineering debrief had ended. The timing was intentional, deliberately chosen to ensure the paddock had cleared just enough for discretion, but not so much that the absence of noise wouldn't be noticed. Hamilton was directed to a narrow corridor that led to a hidden door behind the telemetry room, a door that no one used unless something sensitive needed to be discussed away from ears, eyes, or interruptions. The lighting was sterile, the air thick with tension, and the atmosphere more courtroom than conversation. No media representatives, no performance analysts, no assistants. Just Vasseur, sitting with his back rigid and jaw clenched, and Hamilton standing tall with the quiet intensity of a man who had waited too long for this confrontation. The door shut with a soft thud, and in that sound echoed all the frustration of a season unraveling in plain sight. Vasseur spoke first, his tone deceptively measured, one that betrayed the simmering anger beneath his words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were sharp, calculated, and each syllable carried the weight of disappointment. He asked Hamilton whether he truly grasped the magnitude of the storm he had unleashed. Not just on the team, but on the brand, the legacy, the meticulously cultivated image of Ferrari. He asked if Lewis was aware of how his public comments, broadcast across the world, had painted the Scuderia as fractured, dysfunctional, and directionless. He questioned whether Hamilton understood what it meant for mechanics, engineers, aerodynamicists, and strategists to have their efforts questioned by their own driver in front of millions. Hamilton's reply was immediate. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't deflect. He responded with precision, his voice calm and unsentimental. He started by referencing every technical report he had submitted, every warning he had issued, every internal message he had flagged and followed up on, each one either dismissed, delayed, or buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. He spoke about telemetry inconsistencies that had been ignored, about hybrid system inefficiencies that had gone unresolved for 3 consecutive races. He detailed, with the accuracy of a seasoned veteran, how power unit cooling systems were insufficient under high-load scenarios, how the energy recovery system failed to deliver optimal deployment during crucial phases of qualifying, how downforce targets set in Maranello's CFD simulations never translated into stability on track. He didn't flinch as he listed these things. He didn't even blink. Vasseur listened, arms folded, nodding slowly with the expression of a man who had heard enough but wasn't ready to concede. When he spoke again, the words were biting. He said that Hamilton's behavior had crossed a line. That speaking out in front of cameras, journalists, and international audiences wasn't just reckless, it was insubordination masked as honesty. He said that Ferrari demanded respect from within before it could project strength to the outside world. He accused Lewis of prioritizing personal narrative over collective unity. Hamilton leaned forward then, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. There was no sarcasm in his voice, only a low, unwavering fire. He asked a simple question: how long was he expected to smile through mediocrity? How long should he keep pretending that optimism alone could fix systemic rot? He said there was a difference between being patient and being silent. He explained that he had come to Ferrari to build, to lead, to elevate. Not to babysit broken promises or recycle outdated philosophies. Ferrari is a legend, he said, but legends don't win races. People do. Execution does. Boldness does. Vasseur stiffened. He replied that Ferrari would always be bigger than any one man. That no driver, no matter how many titles he carried, would ever eclipse the badge. Hamilton looked him dead in the eye. And what does that badge mean if no one inside is willing to evolve with it? The conversation ended without resolution. There was no handshake, no gesture of mutual understanding. Hamilton stood up, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and left the room with a kind of silence that spoke louder than any words. The door closed behind him, soft but final. Hours passed. Mechanics packed up equipment. Engineers avoided one another's gaze. The sun began to sink behind the grandstands. And while most of the paddock dissolved into scattered clusters of personnel heading to hotels or motorhomes, Lewis Hamilton changed quietly into civilian clothes and exited through a lesser-used back corridor that led toward the Mercedes compound. No cameras followed. A lone security guard saw him and, recognizing the man and the moment, simply nodded and let him through. Inside the Mercedes hospitality suite, the atmosphere was dim and still. The usual rhythm of engineers talking softly over laptops was gone. At a corner table, Toto Wolff sat alone, nursing a nearly finished glass of scotch, the scent of smoke and fatigue lingering in the air. He didn't rise when Lewis entered. He didn't need to. The two men had shared too many wars together to require ceremony. Lewis took a seat opposite him. He didn't offer pleasantries. He didn't ask for a drink. He just stared at the glass, then at the man he once called a partner in greatness. Toto looked at him, eyes calm but alert, waiting. "I saw what happened," he said. Lewis nodded slightly, eyes low. "It's worse than it looks," he said. "And it already looks like a disaster." He began to speak, not with bitterness, but with brutal clarity. He explained how what began as ambition turned to confusion, then slowly became resignation. He described how Ferrari's internal structure discouraged innovation, how their obsession with image left no room for vulnerability, how engineers had stopped suggesting bold changes because they feared being blamed, how race strategy meetings had turned into safe echo chambers. "They want to be seen as warriors," Lewis said, "but they don't want to hear the roar." Toto listened without interruption. When Lewis paused, he asked only one question. "Do you regret it?" The answer didn't take long. I regret believing that mythology could be converted into momentum. I regret thinking tradition could substitute for adaptability. But I don't regret trying. You know me, I had to try. Toto refilled his glass. And now? Lewis didn't hesitate. Now I want to finish what I started. Not there. Here. Where I belong. Not for nostalgia. For purpose. I want to lead again. I want to shape a team that listens, that evolves, that races with hunger, not fear. Wolf raised an eyebrow. Russell's here. Antonelli's coming. The board is obsessed with the future. Youth sells. Lewis smiled faintly. So does winning. And experience wins when things go wrong. You don't shortcut leadership. You don't fake chemistry. You earn it. I'm not fading. I'm sharpening. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. They discussed philosophies, development cycles, culture, ambition. They talked about the difference between legacy and leadership, between hype and substance. They didn't speak in timelines or contracts. They spoke in conviction. When Lewis stood up to leave, the night had deepened into silence. Nothing official had been agreed upon. There were no signatures. No cameras waiting. But the air had shifted. There was alignment, not in words, but in intention. Race day came with heavy clouds and high humidity. As Hamilton sat in his Ferrari, his helmet mirrored the gray sky. He went through the motions, straps, radio check, visor down. But his mind was distant. The track lights blinked. The race began. From the opening laps, the car betrayed him. The balance was inconsistent. Corner exit speeds were erratic. The rear was unstable under braking. He tried to adapt, to recalibrate, but by lap 31, the same issue surfaced once again. He keyed the radio. Power is inconsistent again on the straight. What's going on? The engineer's voice cracked slightly. We're seeing high temperatures. Managing deployment too. I told you about this after Jeddah. I told you again after Melbourne. You've changed nothing. There was no anger in his voice, only fatigue, edged with frustration. It was the sound of a man who had reached the point where solutions were no longer expected. Just patterns confirmed. His pace wasn't catastrophic, but it lacked the bite, the intent. He was driving not to compete, but to finish. When he crossed the line in fifth, he didn't acknowledge the post-race radio message. He parked the car, stepped out, and walked with mechanical focus through the paddock. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. His eyes didn't move. His hands didn't rise. His feet didn't falter. Inside the Ferrari garage, no one spoke. Screens still showed the lap times, but no one looked at them. Hamilton had already vanished down the corridor. Later that evening, when most of the world had turned in for the night and only the most obsessed motorsport fans remained online, something extraordinary happened. Lewis Hamilton, without warning, without context, without offering even a whisper of explanation, shared a photo across all of his social media platforms. It wasn't a selfie. It wasn't a team post. It wasn't a promotional campaign. It was instead a simple yet haunting image, his 2020 Mercedes helmet, a sleek symbolic artifact of an era dominated by speed, dominance, and brilliance, placed with deliberate care on an elegant black velvet chair. The composition was minimalist, but charged with meaning. The caption that accompanied the image was even more enigmatic. Sometimes home isn't a place. It's a feeling. Those 7 words were like an ignition spark. In that single instant, an entire sport was jolted from its usual rhythm. There was no official statement. No interview was given. No follow-up story. But none was necessary. For those deeply ingrained in the world of Formula One, those who lived and breathed telemetry, lap times, and legacy, the message was unmistakable. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't tribute. It was a coded signal. A subtle but potent emotional detonation. Something had shifted. Something had begun. Hamilton's post, at once poetic and loaded with potential, sent shockwaves through every layer of the motorsport community, from casual observers to senior engineers and PR strategists. Within minutes of the post going live, the digital ecosystem erupted. Online forums became overloaded with speculation. Twitter, or X, as it had come to be known, saw fan theories trend globally in multiple languages. YouTube live streams were spun up in real time. Fans began analyzing the photo's background, its lighting, the model of the helmet, the stitching of the velvet. Reddit threads grew at breakneck speed. Some users offered timelines. Others proposed contractual analysis. Still others dug up old interviews, searching for breadcrumbs in past answers, forgotten facial expressions, half-smiles that might now appear as clues. What began as a post became a battleground of interpretations, with fans, media, and insiders all racing to get ahead of a story that hadn't even officially started. Inside Mercedes headquarters in Brackley, activity surged overnight. While publicly, the team offered no comment, behind closed doors, sources claimed that engineers began revisiting archived data from Hamilton's dominant seasons. Some whispered that simulation models, usually reserved for upcoming circuits or weather scenarios, were being altered to reflect the driving profile of one particular individual, the seven-time world champion himself. Reports surfaced that after-hours simulator bookings had been made under anonymized tags. Engineers were said to be reviewing compound where patterns based on Hamilton's input style, a move that would make little sense unless a potential return was being seriously evaluated. This wasn't just romantic indulgence. It was preemptive preparation. A proactive investigation into what would be needed should the unthinkable become real. On the legal side, murmurs began circulating around contract law circles in London and Milan. Barristers and consultants familiar with elite athlete agreements noted sudden upticks in non-disclosure requests and vague inquiries surrounding escape clauses. Some pointed directly to Hamilton's current deal with Ferrari, an agreement that had been globally celebrated but still relatively fresh. Behind the scenes, Hamilton's personal legal advisors were allegedly combing through every clause, subclause, and ambiguous phrase. Were there provisions for early exit? Were there sponsorship conflicts that could be used as leverage? Could a performance clause, perhaps buried deep within the language of the deal, be invoked due to recent results or internal disagreements? Meanwhile, within Ferrari's walls in Maranello, tension began to thicken. Executives, once proudly confident about their historic signing, now found themselves in a mode of complete internal containment. Communications staff were silenced. Marketing campaigns that featured Hamilton were quietly paused. Engineers and strategic personnel close to him were instructed to avoid the media at all costs. Internal briefings became curt, controlled, and off the record. Ferrari wasn't just worried about losing a star driver, it was facing a potential reputational firestorm, one that could upend the delicate equilibrium of a season still unfolding. Simultaneously, Mercedes team principal, Toto Wolff, reportedly held a late-night video meeting with a select circle of Daimler board members, financial stakeholders, and strategic partners. This wasn't a decision-making session, it was reconnaissance, an effort to chart out possible futures. What would it mean for team dynamics? Could a returning Hamilton coexist with George Russell, who had been long nurtured as the heir apparent? What would be the psychological effect on Kimi Antonelli, the teenage sensation who was already being prepped for a gradual but historic promotion into the big leagues? Every possibility was being gamed out. Every scenario was being calculated not in terms of emotion, but in terms of risk, reward, and timing. George Russell, who had navigated his career with poise and patience, was privately seething, according to insiders. Though he remained publicly silent, perhaps out of strategic discipline or contractual obligation, those in his inner circle reported that he felt brushed aside, disrespected, and disposable. Having spent seasons growing within the Mercedes ecosystem, gradually taking on more responsibility and delivering consistent performances, he now saw the narrative spiral into a fantasy about the past rather than the future. His demeanor reportedly shifted. He became less communicative during internal debriefs. Engineers noticed shorter responses, clipped tone, and a distant look in meetings. One insider described him as mentally elsewhere, calculating his options. Even more delicate was the situation involving Kimi Antonelli. The prodigious Italian teenager had been built up in recent months as the crown jewel of Mercedes' junior development program, a rare talent being fast-tracked toward F1 stardom. But now his father, Luca Antonelli, was seen in increasingly serious conversations with legal representatives and sponsors. The concern was clear: if Hamilton returned, would Kimi's ascension be halted? Would he lose valuable track time? Would the mentorship role that had been quietly outlined for him disappear altogether? There was frustration, even fear. Not of competition, but of opportunity slipping away. This wasn't a matter of talent, it was a question of timing, and the clock had suddenly started spinning in reverse. Beyond the corridors of power and technical briefings, the emotional earthquake was playing out in full view on social media. The F1 fanbase, which often splits neatly along team and driver loyalties, fractured into chaos. Supporters of Hamilton rejoiced, posting edits of him in the black overalls, helmet cam footage from his dominant years, dramatic montages of radio calls and race wins. Some begged him to finish what he started at Mercedes. Others warned him not to tarnish his legacy with a second act that might not live up to the myth. Ferrari loyalists felt betrayed, calling it abandonment before a project could even mature. Some saw it as Hamilton succumbing to comfort. Others viewed it as pure strategic genius. Behind the scenes, even Netflix began scrambling. The producers of Drive to Survive, always hunting for drama, immediately initiated emergency editorial changes. Plans were made to reallocate screen time, bump other storylines, and build a narrative arc solely focused on the Hamilton-Mercedes-Ferrari triangle. Camera crews pivoted overnight. Requests for exclusive interviews increased. Archival footage from 2014 to 2021 was pulled for re-editing. The potential return of Hamilton wasn't just sport, it was cinematic gold. It was ratings. It was history in the making, unfolding in real time. In media rooms across Europe and beyond, sports journalists hit panic mode. Articles were rewritten mid-publication. Podcasts aired emergency episodes. Talk show hosts debated contractual ethics and psychological warfare. Radio commentators speculated over every nuance. Some tried to trace the timeline. When did the first signs appear? Was it that moment in Bahrain when Hamilton hesitated in his post-race interview? Or the unusually long hug between him and Toto in Monaco? Even his silence after qualifying in Barcelona now felt like a breadcrumb. Every pause was re-examined. Every glance dissected. By the next sunrise, Formula One was no longer on autopilot. The structured, scheduled world of free practice sessions, tire strategies, and team PR was swept away in a tide of emotion, calculation, and possibility. It was no longer a question of whether Lewis Hamilton would leave Ferrari and return to Mercedes. The sport had moved past that. The real question was how deep the preparations already went, how many deals had already been struck, how many bridges had already been crossed in secret, and what the rest of the paddock was prepared to sacrifice to either stop, support, or survive the most monumental comeback F1 might ever witness. Behind the carefully maintained facade of team PR campaigns, official interviews, and choreographed media moments, a different story was unfolding in silence, one that few truly understood, but many suspected. Beyond the reach of camera lenses and away from the scripted soundbites delivered on race weekends, a web of activity had begun to form, covert, intense, deliberate. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a few cryptic text messages between longtime confidants, vague references in off-the-record conversations, unexpected changes in travel plans, and brief but meaningful exchanges between familiar faces during moments no one paid attention to. But soon what began as scattered whispers had grown into something more substantial, more calculated, and infinitely more consequential. The air around the paddock grew heavier, and everyone, from team insiders to veteran journalists, sensed the shifting momentum without knowing exactly what was causing it. Private communications increased in frequency and importance. Secure lines buzzed at odd hours. Call logs were carefully erased. Voice modulators, burner devices, even facial recognition-proof meeting rooms. Nothing was off the table when it came to protecting the integrity of the unfolding process. Proposals were floated without attribution. Hypothetical frameworks were introduced in abstract conversations to test reactions. Everything was unofficial, undocumented, spoken aloud only in hushed tones and behind doors locked tight. And yet, it was all real, terrifyingly real. Executives with tight schedules suddenly made time for unscheduled meetings. Financial officers reviewed contract structures that hadn't been relevant in years. Logistics teams were told to prepare contingencies without being told why. Legal departments received vague but urgent requests for advice on unprecedented clauses and untested boundaries of driver-team relationships. These weren't ordinary talks. These were high-stakes, multi-layered strategic discussions involving not just performance metrics and car development timelines, but branding power, intercontinental marketing leverage, and future technical influence. Multiple teams were quietly involved, each trying to outmaneuver the others, but all trying to remain invisible. No public statements were issued. No leaks were allowed. But the pieces on the chessboard were being moved, and the position of the king, one man, one driver, whose decisions carried more weight than entire engineering departments, was central to everything. In his mind, clarity was beginning to form, slowly but surely. The disillusionment had been building for months, perhaps years, disguised beneath layers of loyalty, commitment, and professionalism. He had invested more than most could comprehend: time, skill, emotional endurance, and above all, faith. Faith in a team that had promised transformation, dominance, revolution. But what he had witnessed instead was dysfunction masked by passion, rhetoric that evaporated under pressure, and a culture more concerned with optics than results. The garage was loud with slogans, but quiet with solutions. Strategy meetings became cycles of repetition. Technical feedback was lost in bureaucracy. Each race weekend brought another wave of compromise disguised as ambition. And slowly, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't angry. It was calm, clinical, and unstoppable. A realization that belief alone could not win titles. That symbolic gestures could not replace operational excellence. That intention without structure was merely hope, and hope was not enough anymore. He looked around and saw a machine struggling to function, a legacy brand trapped in the nostalgia of its own past, incapable of delivering the future it once promised him. But there was something else, buried beneath the frustration, a distant but vivid memory of another environment, a system where success was not dramatized but engineered, where meetings began with data, not declarations, where decisions were made by those who understood the machinery, not those who wanted to be seen making them. He remembered the feeling of stepping into a cockpit knowing the car was an extension of his own precision, not a puzzle he had to solve mid-race. He remembered the stillness before qualifying sessions, the quiet confidence of a team that didn't need to talk because they knew. He remembered silver. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about alignment. About finding an environment where performance was non-negotiable, where discipline was the culture, not the exception. He wasn't chasing his past. He was constructing a future, one built on trust earned through competence, not marketing. And as his current surroundings crumbled under the weight of unmet expectations and failed evolution, the idea of returning to that foundation, to that structure, began to crystallize. Still, outwardly, he gave nothing away. His demeanor remained controlled, his language careful. But internally, he was already crossing thresholds. He had started thinking in terms of timelines, assessing contract frameworks, analyzing project development cycles. He initiated contact through back channels. He requested anonymized feedback from key engineers. He cross-referenced power unit data from the last 5 seasons. Every move was calculated. Every silence intentional. Even his interactions in the paddock were choreographed, some deliberate, others withheld entirely. He knew the sport watched his every move, interpreted every eyebrow raise, every glance, every casual handshake. And so he turned that attention into misdirection, making noise where there was none, and going silent where the real action occurred. Within the corridors of influence, his name was being spoken with gravity. Teams revised their budgets to account for his hypothetical salary. Aerodynamic departments were instructed to simulate driver profiles that matched his aggressive mid-corner style. Even simulator teams were told to prepare contingency programs. He wasn't just being pursued, he was being prepared for. As if his return was inevitable. As if the universe of Formula One had already begun to adapt itself around the possibility of his defection. And what a defection it would be. Not merely a change of color or uniform, but a seismic realignment of values, power, and ambition. A rejection of emotional promises in favor of execution. A shift from symbol to system. If he chose to go, it would send shockwaves through every level of the sport. Drivers would reconsider their futures. Sponsors would renegotiate their loyalties. Engineers would request transfers. Boardrooms would panic. Media narratives would collapse. Because he wasn't just a champion, he was a reference point. A force of gravitational pull. Wherever he went, the axis of the sport would follow.